So when it comes to analysing this poem, there are two angles to go down. And the key thing about these two angles is you cannot commit to either side. People, of course, have their opinions, but you cannot commit. Because Keats himself has said he believes in this concept called negative capability. Now, this is me touching a little bit more into almost like an A-level standard of understanding, but I think it's useful to know because a lot of students are like, well, how can there be these two different interpretations to this poem that are so opposite? Like, what could he possibly have intended? And negative capability helps us to understand that. So bear with me for a second. So negative capability is the idea that a person's potential, I'm getting this from the British Library, by the way, this definition of negative capability, a person's potential can be defined by what he or she does not possess. In this case, a need to be clever, a determination to work everything out. In other words, Keats would roll over in his grave to know that this was on a GCSE course and students around the world were being forced to analyse every single word to death. Because what he wanted was not to be obsessed with figuring out what something means, but just to sort of passively accept and to let go of the obsession with knowledge, and instead just appreciate something for its sort of beauty and truth that's in it. Now, the concept of negative capability can be talked about on literally like an undergraduate degree of English level, and there might be some people at the comments who come at me for not interpreting it correctly, blah, 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 whatever, I don't care. For the purposes of a GCSE level of understanding, my point is that Keats is not trying to make a point. He is just telling this, what he perceives as beautiful narrative, and we take our own interpretation from that. So what is that interpretation? There are two most common ways that people have interpreted this particular poem. The first is that Keats intends everything that he's saying. The really anti-women message of this poem, this idea that women seduce men and destroy them in a consequence. Like, love is something all-consuming, obsessive, that leaves men pale and weak at the end of it. That's path one. That's what he means, that's what he intends. Pathway two is more like he is mocking that idea. He's parodying that idea. He's using the concept of medieval romance to mock this femme fatale image of women being manipulative seductresses who destroy men, and instead he's pointing out the sort of self-inflated ego of these men, their inherent sort of hypocrisies, their attempts to control women, that kind of thing. So as we go through the poem, we'll keep looking at it from those two angles. You know, how could you see it as, on a very simplistic, basic level, pro-women, anti-women kind of poem? Now we're going to start by looking at these first two stanzas. Now there's a clear pattern throughout this stanza with a semantic field of weakness. So we've got pale, ale, haggard, woebegone. There's also some more in the third stanza as well. The anguish, fading, withereth. Massive semantic field of weakness to describe our knight. The problem is that semantic field of weak greatly contrasts with what we would expect of a knight. We expect medieval knights to be chivalrous, brave, persevering no matter the hardship. So to have this semantic field of weakness subverting our expectations could be going in two different potential directions. One direction is that it's all about exploring the power of love, and how even someone as chivalrous and brave and gallant as a knight can be consumed, can be destroyed by women and their seductive powers and their love for the women. I think there's also room though, if we're taking this poem to be more of like a parody, mocking that, the semantic field is a part of a bigger technique going on of just making this knight seem hella over dramatic and sort of mocking a mocking image of someone just like, oh, woe is me, poor me. And so there's a few different things in addition to the semantic field of weakness that make that. One is the fact that this is all written in sort of archaic language. So of course Keats is trying to replicate the medieval language of that time. He's trying to really take us back to that feel of medieval romance and medieval chivalry. But in using archaic to do it, again, is he doing that because it's about recreating that ultimate era of love and romance and honor and decency and all these other positive ways of viewing medieval romance? Or is it part of making it feel all very over dramatic with the archaic language that makes it sound more fancy and elevated than it actually is? Especially when you take like the emotion that is conveyed in some of the language, like, oh, what can ail thee, and it feeling very quite like over the top. And so if we're taking this to be a sense of almost mocking our knight, the semantic field of weakness would be the fact that it seems so extreme and strong. And when we have these interrogatives like, what can ail thee, the sedge has withered from the lake and no birds sing, it's almost like our speaker is saying, what's the matter with you? So I interpret this first question where we have the interrogative and then the sedge has withered from the lake and no birds sing. I interpret that as being like, why are you here all alone lying here? It's winter, for goodness sake. What are you doing outside? And then this second one is more of a, why do you look so sad and ill when, you know, this is good. The harvest is done, the squirrel's granary is full, there is prosperity and everything is prepared for winter. So what's the matter with you? So is there in these interrogatives a potential belittling, mocking tone of, you know, why are you acting as if this is like you're dying when everything is fine, like you just chosen to sit outside in the winter like some kind of fool? However, there is still room to argue that this is all about trying to create sympathy for our knight as well. And we pity him because it's like, oh, you've been through such a difficult thing. And that's partly created by the symbolism in the lily and the rose. Now, there's a few different ways to interpret our lily and our rose. The classic symbols of these is, first of all, death, and then the rose for romance. Now, if we take the lily to be death, then a lily on thy brow, he's dying. A fading rose fast withereth too, he's heartbroken. Literally, he's losing love from his face, so he is sad because of being heartbroken. However, when we consider that Keats is really trying to embody this idea of medieval literature, you know, this is written as a ballad, which is a form of poetry that came out in the medieval times, a sort of narrative style of poetry, typically often associated with like really sad stories and things. But he's using this archaic language as well. He's really trying to capture the time, the medieval time. So it's fair game to wonder if he's using medieval symbolism of lily and rose as well. So when we look into the medieval symbolism of lily, that was classically used as a symbol of purity and chastity. So the lily on his brow could be this idea of like, at his core, he is an innocent, virtuous man. Similarly, our rose, that really commonly in the medieval times became a symbol for the wounds of Christ and garland for martyred saints. So in that sense, is he being almost presented as some sort of martyr? Now, if you're not familiar of what a martyr is, has connotations of someone who has sacrificed their life in the name of staying true to their faith, to their beliefs. So are we supposed to be almost comparing this knight to like a saintly figure because he's such a sort of virtuous person who has lost his life to something out of his control and something really, really evil and bad has happened to him? So when we look at our presentation of the knight, there's really sort of contrasting images that we can take from it in terms of whether we're supposed to be looking at him like, guy, seriously? Or, oh, guys, seriously? In terms of how we're supposed to react to him. But no matter what, it's subverting our expectations of what a knight should be. A medieval knight is all about, you know, your kind of Prince Charming, chivalry, saving the day, etc., etc. So that's our knight. if we now go to the way that our lady is presented, when our knight starts telling the story about this lady, again, there's going to be two ways of looking at her. Are we dealing with a sort of controlled woman who is being perceived and presented in a certain way that is beyond her control? Or are we dealing with a femme fatale, someone very deliberately trying to seduce and manipulate him? Now, part of why we can't decide either way is, of course, that we are dealing with an unreliable narrator. We don't know who the actual speaker of our poem is, but essentially this poem is like secondhand because our speaker has been and spoken to a knight and is then telling the knight's story, but also it's the knight's story. So everything is from the perception of our knight and how he interpreted events, how he saw everything that was going on. And what the knight tells us is that he met a lady in a meadow, full beautiful, a fairy's child. So we have this, first of all, obviously she's described as being very beautiful, very physically beautiful. That description of her being a fairy's child. Now there's two different ways to interpret that depending on how we want to view our woman. So the first way, the positive way about her beauty, it creates a sense of a sort of otherworldly beauty. Like she's so beautiful, it's something that isn't even seem like human about her. On the other hand, if we consider the medieval perception of fairies, we also potentially have an ominous foreshadowing of the femme fatale role she is going to have. Because it was really common in the medieval times for them to legit believe in fairies. And fairies were perceived as sort of like tricksters, manipulators, and in the beliefs of the church, in the writings of the church, they were minions of the devil. So in that sense, him referring to her as fairy's child could be that foreshadowing of her sort of evil intentions, the fact that she cannot be trusted. Similarly, when we get to this description of what she looks like, her hair is long, her foot was light. So the light has connotations of being very like graceful, being elegant, and that's part of her beauty, fitting very sort of classically within medieval romance of what those beautiful medieval women should be like. But at the same time, her eyes are said to be wild. Now, is that suggesting that she has a sense of like passion about her? Or is that suggesting that she is unpredictable? She cannot be controlled. So again, is wild a positive way of looking at her as like she's filled with emotion and passion in her eyes, and you can really see that? Or is it, you can't trust this girl, you don't know what she's going to do? When we then come to our next stanza of the garland, the bracelets, the fragrance zone, now they could all represent the knight's adoration of this woman, because it's this semantic field of like gifts. He's giving her all of these things, and in particular by using the maid, those connotations of like care and effort on his part on what he's done for her. However, another way of interpreting this, when we look at the garland, the bracelets, the fragrance zone, them all being circles, and the fact that they are around the sort of the waist, the wrist, the head, it could also create this feeling of sort of overwhelming entrapment, and also a little bit of obsessive behavior as well. That sort of, giving her this and this and this. If you look at that syndetic listing, that mounting sense of gifts on gifts on gifts. So Keats could be just outright looking at how much this man loves her, that power of love, that he adores her and wants to give her everything that he can. But it could also be mocking the sort of overload, gift overload, the overload, the obsession with trying to please the person that you love with all of these gifts. And when we have our next line, she looked at me as she did love, that as creates an ambiguity to the line. Is it that she looked at me with, I actually love you? Like she's looking at me with love? In which case, the fact that that comes in the same stanza as him giving the gifts would fit with this idea of medieval romance and the power of love, of like, give a woman stuff and she'll like you. It could be suggesting at the fact that she can't be trusted, that she's manipulating him, because we can interpret that phrase as if she loved me, as in she doesn't really love me, but she's just acting as if she does. Now the maid's sweet moan, again, two ways we're going to be able to look at this. One way is that it's a euphemism for sex. I have also seen, by the way, the fragrant zone be seen as a euphemism for sex as well. So it's like the fragrant zone is perhaps referring to her sort of like genital area, and he's gifting something for that area. I'm not sure. I'm less convinced about the euphemism for sex in that part. But for sure, somebody making sweet moan, pretty clear there that there is a euphemism for sex. But not even necessarily that they've actually engaged in a sexual act, but more of just like pleasure. Like this idea of this woman is so happy with everything this man is doing for her. He doesn't even need to touch her, and she's just moaning out of sheer joy of how much she loves him, and how, you know, she's now got pretty flowers in her hair, and that's, you know, an orgasmic experience in some kind of way. That would be very fitting with a sort of over-the-top, over-dramatic presentation of medieval romance, and the way that women would be presented. You know, all they need is for a man to look nicely at them, and they'll faint and swoon because they cannot handle their feelings and their strong emotions. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this is an indicator that our knight had sex with this woman. It could indicate that, absolutely a possibility, but I think it's more likely, considering just the context of the time, of the medieval time, and the behaviors, I think it's more likely reflecting that idea of, you know, women are just so over emotional, they are likely to just moan out loud because they can't contain their joy and pleasure from the man loving them so much. On the other hand, if we were to flip it, we could also perhaps look at the fact of moaning in its connotations of complaint, of unhappiness, and is it by juxtaposing that with the adjective sweet, is it Keats pointing out that the man, the knight, is failing to recognize that she's unhappy, that she, you know, doesn't like something he's doing, because he's just like, oh, it's so sweet, it's so beautiful, etc. So it's this sort of egotistical, it's all about, you know, I wanted to give her all this stuff and you know, get her to love me and get her to want me. And there's also, of course, an element, as we see historically in the past, is it that way of presenting women where they're only pretending they're not happy, you know? Like, it's okay. A woman is supposed to be like, oh no, this is too much. I don't want this. And men are seeing that as a sort of romantic ploy. And that's why it's sweet moan. Like, she's complaining in a romantic way, pretending as if she doesn't want it. That being said, it could also be Keats being like, nah mate, she doesn't want it. You're just failing to see that because you're so obsessed with your idealized fantasy of who she is, and what this love is, what this romance is. Where we then come to, I set her on my pacing steed. So the use of the active voice is interesting there. So the active voice just means that the sort of grammar of the sentence is subject, verb, object. So the subject, I, does something to the object. In this case, the object is her. So what the active voice is doing is placing our knight in a position of dominance over her woman. He is very much in control. Now, again, two ways to interpret this. Is this a sort of chivalrous act of him putting her on the back of his horse and really caring about her and wanting to make sure she doesn't have to walk, and you know, his adoration, he's giving up his horse for her and he's putting her on it? Or is it about domination? Is it about control? There have again been suggestions that the pacing steed is a euphemism for sex again. So there is also a potential to view this line quite darkly in terms of, is it suggesting a sort of sexual form of sexual abuse, sexual behavior without consent there? He's very much in control. He's deciding what they are going to do together. But again, I would hesitate on that, just because the whole point of knights is they were meant to be very virtuous and very chivalrous. So it's more likely about that behavior of putting a woman on a horse, and you know what that could all suggest about how you're treating her. The nothing else saw all day long. So the extremities connoted by nothing and all create this sense of obsession. And whether we are meant to be viewing that obsession positively or negatively comes down to the interpretation you're taking of La Belle Dame. So is it a case of Keats is exploring the power of love and how women can become all-consuming for men very, very quickly, because he met this woman like 2 minutes ago? Or is it sort of mocking and parodying that obsession by making it so extreme? We then have this bit about, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy's song. So the sidelong, as I already told you about, she's sitting side saddle, but we could also wonder, is there a sort of metaphorical element for that? Does it have connotations of not being fully open, not being completely honest? Because of course it's on the side, so it's that element of she's not showing her full self, her true self to him. So is it more foreshadowing of the fact that we can't trust this woman? And the fact that she sings to him a fairy's song. So again, there's sort of magical connotations of fairies. Is it sort of like she's being a seduction, a seducer? Is it like a siren's song? Is it her trying to use her beauty to control him, to manipulate him in some way? Or is it just he really loves her and he's therefore obsessed with watching her singing this beautiful song because it's really lovely to him? We have more here that raises questions about how we're supposed to be viewing this lady. So she found me roots of relish sweet and honey wild and manna dew. Now, manna is essentially, to cut a long Bible story short, manna is seen as like food from heaven and is associated with you're sort of being essential for survival. So the fact that we have this semantic field of provisions, the sweet roots, the wild honey, the manna dew, could all be linking to this idea of how women are everything to men. They provide for them, they can't live without them. However, there is another way of interpreting it in terms of that sort of ominous foreshadowing, because of the imagery of wild honey and roots and dew. Is it more of a sort of herbal concoction? Is it more of a potion? Again, fitting with that quite magical way of viewing our fairy child here, especially when we consider that with the language strange. Now, it's not clear, it's very ambiguous in what way is her language strange, but it fits with this idea of it almost being perhaps some sort of spell. So on the one hand, we've got a way of viewing this as a woman caring for someone and how men can view women as being essential for their survival. But on another hand, we've got, essentially a magical witch slowly but surely seducing him via her magical potions and what she says to him. And it's interesting, if we think of the language strange as being supposed to suggest almost like a spell, and what she says is, I love thee true, I really love you. It's like being in love is the spell. And Keats is trying to explore how love can make you, essentially that idea of you're under love's spell, that very classic idiom of how love can just completely change you and make you obsessed and control you. That also continues when we have in our opening line to the very next stanza, the elfin grot. So again, it feels like a very magical setting for her to live in an elf's cave. So throughout, what we've really got throughout this poem when it comes to this woman is a sort of semantic field of magic, or perhaps fantasy. And we can ask ourselves, is that semantic field of magic and fantasy there because Keats is trying to examine that magical element of love and how it can feel almost how it can be idealized, and he's mocking the idealization, the fantasy of love, and how people aren't seeing the reality of it? Or is he sort of pointing out how love can become obsessive and completely change you and overwhelm you so quickly because it is like a sort of magic? It has this power over you that you wouldn't necessarily expect. What's also important to note in this stanza is the power shift. So before we had I set her, now we have she took me. So there's a little, again, ominous foreshadowing there with the swap in the active voice, because now it is the woman in the more dominant position, and that's where things are going to sort of start taking their turn. However, what we still have is this line where she cries for literally, if you can see the reason, if you figured out why she's suddenly crying, please say something in the comments, because to me this appears to come absolutely out of nowhere. But of course that could fit with our unreliability of our narrator. It's very possible he did something and he's completely clueless as to what he's done, and the very fact that he's unable to recognize why she would be crying, why she would be so upset, is reflecting the fact that he's just seeing her as this fantasy magical thing and is therefore struggling to understand the humanity of her behavior and why she's doing what she is doing. It could, though, also be fitting in with the damsel in distress medieval image of, you know, women, they just can't handle their emotions, you know, it's just all very strong, it's all very emotional, and then just, you know, they cry sometimes for no apparent reason, and they need a big strong man to come and make them feel better. What's interesting, of course, is about the chivalrous way that our knight tries to make her feel better. I shut her wild, wild eyes. So again, that active voice, he has control over her, especially if you look at that repetition of wild there, and we think about how that connoted something maybe more predictable, maybe more passionate. The fact that he is shutting that down, it's like he's taking her under his control, essentially. And the way that he is controlling her is with, you know, those 4 kisses, because of course, you know, love is how men can have their dominance and control over women. They have it via this sort of loving, chivalrous dominance. Now, I'm not quite sure why Keats went as far as kisses 4. Typically, numbers in the 3s indicate some kind of like magic. So if it had been kisses 3, kisses 6, kisses 9, maybe it would have suggested a magical element on the knight's part, and he didn't want to do that. But by having him kiss her lots and lots and lots, that number indicates, again, a sort of intensity and an obsession and an in deep adoration of our woman, and the fact that he is kissing her so many times. There is also a different way to view this, considering what's about to happen. So considering what's about to happen is that she's about to have lulled him to sleep, and he's going to realize that actually she's the one in control. She is the one with the power here. This could be Keats sort of mocking, pointing out the irony, the sort of ignorance of our knight, in that he thinks he is the one in control when in reality she's the one in control. So whether that irony is because Keats is looking to mock male ignorance and how they're so obsessed with the fantasy of chivalry and being this great knight that they fail to see the reality in front of them, or because he's aiming to look at, you know, how women can seduce, and part of the way they seduce is by making the man think that they're the ones with all the power and control, when actually then they're the women are the ones sort of manipulating and pulling all the puppet strings. Both interpretations very valid there. So in our next stanza, of course, Our Lady gets him to fall asleep, and again that active voice is key to showing she is the one now in control. Just a quick note to add, like that woe betide, the use of that ekphonesis, you'll be familiar with this technique if you've seen my video on Sonnet 116 by Shakespeare. Ekphonesis is just when there is a short exclamatory in a poem, and it's about showing that sort of really strong emotion. So in this case, our knight is having almost, as he thinks back to this dream he has, is having a sort of sudden emotional reaction and exclamation, which could be part of what we talked about earlier with this guy as being so overdramatic and so over the top and sort of mocking his over the top melodrama. Or it could be, oh, this poor guy, he was so in love and now he feels utterly devastated that he's been betrayed and it's not love like he thought it was. So that our woe betide just fits in with what we were saying before about the, where can I find it? Yes, about the sort of overdramatic, archaic language, you know, and the weakness that this knight is feeling. But if we have a look at this dream that he's got, so first of all, as I've already mentioned, the repetition of pale is supposed to echo the appearance of our knight. So it's really clearly making us understand that the knight is going through what these guys have already been through, and so this dream is like a warning to them. And then there's also a semantic field of chivalry in here. If we think about kings, princes, warriors, all chivalrous figures, particularly when we're dealing with medieval times. And so the fact that you've got this semantic field of chivalry in all these other people who have succumbed to this seductress, it's making a comment of, you know, yes, the knight is not the first, but also that all of these incredibly, if you think of the power suggested, the strength suggested by kings and warriors, the fact that they have succumbed to our fairy child, to our beautiful lady, is again part of showing that power of love, and is potentially part of building the sympathy for our knight, because, you know, he's very much not alone in this. People even more powerful than him, like kings, have succumbed to this. So it could be part of the sort of femme fatale image that, you know, anybody can fall victim to a woman's seductive powers. Or if I was going down the parody angle, I might perhaps argue that these are all men with a great deal of power, and it creating a sense of perhaps that it is the most powerful men whose egos are most subject into thinking that they have all the power, they have all the control, and not having, and as a result perhaps idealize women, romanticize women, and don't take them as seriously. Them crying La Belle Dame Sans Merci, the use of French is just part of really creating that medieval feel. The French were, and French ideas of chivalry and romance were up there with the English in terms of how well known they were, how influential it is throughout history. We don't need to worry too much about the specifics and nuances of the history of this time, but, you know, the French are huge in this time period in Europe, and that's why he's using French. It just helps add to that sort of more romantic imagery, medieval imagery, but essentially what it translates to is the beautiful lady without mercy. So if we think about the fact that that was the title, the very title of the poem was sort of foreshadowing the threat of women from the very beginning and setting them up to be the problem. If I again want to flip it and be like, okay, this is the parody, then I would perhaps argue that the use of the unreliable narrator in the night, it's like his perception of the situation is the threat of women. But we as the people hearing his story, we read it differently, and we see that actually this is about, you know, men blaming women for everything and not taking any responsibility for their sort of romanticization, idealization, failure to recognize the reality of women. Because even in this story, you know, we never get this person's name. Granted, we don't get the knight's name either, but she's always defined in terms of her beauty, La Belle Dame, and then also her seduction, her wildness, her fairiness, her without mercy, her manipulative power, essentially. She's always defined under those two lenses. He never sees her as a human with a distinct personality and character. The hath in thrall, as I've already said, is just about like the knight is now under the spell, completely lacking any power and control in comparison to this beautiful woman. And when we get that imagery, we have a semantic field of weakness being described with our men as well. The starved, the pale, the horrid, all of these different images. So it's again just making it really clear that, you know, our knight has been left as these other, in the same situation as these other men. But I think there's also something particular in the starved, in that connotations of like, you know, you're so obsessed that you haven't been eating. The fact that the dream is a warning as well could perhaps mean that this poem is designed to be a warning. This whole story is designed to be a warning, because it is like the speaker, the knight, are trying to tell everybody, you know, watch out for women, watch out for how they try to seduce you, watch out for how they try to control you. You won't necessarily even see it coming, etc., etc. The fact that he woke and found me here on the cold hills side. Now, I actually forgot to mention this before because we had the cold hill side before. That confusing situation of the setting. So the latest dream I ever dreamt on the cold hillside, when a second ago he was in the elfin grot. That could be a reference to his inability to recognize reality, like he didn't realize where he really was and how things had really changed. And so, you know, that's why there's a bit of a confusion in the setting. Or as I mentioned before, it could just be that he's having this dream over and over, even now that he's on the cold hillside. But of course, the part of that cold hillside, and all of that winter that we had before is that it's like a sort of sympathetic background, right? It's all reflection of the isolation and the sadness that he is feeling without this loved one. That's the significance of this setting. Just as the elfin grot is arguably representative of the sort of magical qualities of Our Lady, the cold hillside is about his, how exposed he is, how isolated he is, how alone he is. And so we get to the last stanza and he basically is saying, that's why I am here all alone. And we have this return to the same imagery that we had at the very, very start of the poem. What's interesting about this last stanza is we have this semantic field of purposelessness, and you can see the words that I've highlighted that are part of that there: sojourn, alone, loitering. And of course we had the alone and loitering also in the very beginning as well. It's like Keats is saying that without love in his life, this knight is completely isolated with nothing to live for anymore. And of course as well, although it's not part of the semantic field, that sympathetic background really contributes to that as well. So the sympathetic background comes in this description of the winter. So sympathetic background is like pathetic fallacy, but specifically to setting. So pathetic fallacy is when the weather represents what somebody is feeling. Sympathetic background is when the setting represents what somebody is feeling. So in this case, the fact that it is winter and the sort of cold, harsh isolation of winter fits with how our knight is feeling really isolated and lonely now that he is without his lady. And that fits again if you think about the fact that he keeps referring to it as the cold hillside. It's that feeling of, emptiness, loss of emotion, not having anyone in their lives to really care about anymore. So overall, you can see that there are two really different ways of looking at this poem. Whether Keats is intending everything he's saying about the sort of, this is looking at using the concept of medieval romance to explore the power of love and how it can impact people and how it can leave them basically heartbroken and destroyed because of these, seductive women that make men fall in love with them and adore them and then, betray them in some way. Or is he mocking the sort of over-the-top, over-dramatic idealization of women and love that prevents people from truly appreciating the reality of the situation that they are in? Make sure you let me know in the comments, which interpretation do you think is more likely to be the one Keats wanted and why? Remembering that actually Keats didn't want us to do any of this, and Keats is very, very upset with us for trying to draw so much knowledge out of his words rather than just appreciating their beauty.